Right, okay, we're going to have a look at this key area, which is making use of microorganisms. So this is key area 5 in your National 4 course. First of all, just having a look at what we mean by a microorganism or what we mean by a microbe, because that's sometimes we use that language as well. Well, we're talking about tiny organisms that are too small to be seen by the unaided eye, so you need to look down a microscope at them. Things like bacteria or fungi, they're all part of microorganisms. And the beauty about microorganisms or of us using them, because we don't always think of microorganisms as being beautiful. We don't think of fungi as being nice to have if we have it on our feet or something like that in an athlete's foot. But we're looking at how we make use of microorganisms and how we use them to make useful products. And the beauty of them is that they can grow rapidly and they use different kind of food sources, and they'll also produce a wide range of products. So we're going to have a look at some examples of the type of microorganisms that we use. Now, we've used microbes or microorganisms for thousands of years to make products which we need and also ones that we enjoy eating, for example. And the first example we're going to have a look at is looking at this here in making food. And using this character here, you don't need to know this name, this very posh name that's here called Lactobacillus acidophilus. What you do need to know is that we do use bacteria, and we use these bacteria, for example, to make yogurt. And we'll talk a wee bit more about how the yogurt is made in a moment. Bacteria is also used in the cheese making process, along with a substance called rennet, and we'll talk a wee bit more about that in the next slides as well. So we've got our yogurt and our cheese making. And if we just move on, we'll have a wee look at our process of yogurt making. Now, I've just said when we're making yogurts, we use bacteria. What the bacteria actually do is they are involved in fermenting the sugar that is there in the milk. Now, there's a sugar in the milk which is called lactose. And what happens is the bacteria break that lactose down into lactic acid. Now, the acid that's there then makes the milk actually curdle. So it's the fact that it turns acidic that makes the milk clump or go lumpy and curdles the milk, and it forms into yogurt. It also gives yogurt that slightly kind of sour taste that yogurt has. But it's the actual bacteria that are involved in doing that process. In the same way, when we come on, we'll just come along here to have a look at cheese making. Again, in cheese making, and I'll leave a wee video for you to watch on cheese making and things like that, but the cheese is made from milk, and we use the bacteria still. We add it to the milk, but we also add an enzyme which is called renin, or sometimes it's called renulase, and you use that or we talked about that in class. But that renin is found in a substance called rennet. Oh, it's a phone ringing in the background. There we are, it's been answered. And what happens is the proteins that are there in the milk, they clump together and they form into solid curds. I've got here, it breaks down the proteins, but you should actually really think about them sort of clumping together more, and they form into the solid curd part, which is the solid bit of the cheese, and the liquid part is the whey, and the whey gets drained away. And we will have a wee look at a video as well on how cheese is made. Moving on to the next slide. Oh, there we are. So the liquid whey is drained off. The curd, the solid part, is left to ripen and mature, and it forms the actual cheese that you want. Sometimes we add other microbes to cheese, and the video you're going to be looking at is going to be looking at blue cheese. And in blue cheese, what happens is that there's been some penicillin mold that's been added to the cheese in the cheese making process, and it gives it that kind of blue moldy colour. Other foods that are created using microorganisms, we're talking about this character here, which is got this very posh name here of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is otherwise known as baker's yeast. Now, yeast is an actual living organism. It's a fungus, and the fungus is used to make bread rise, and the yeast is also used in the beer and the winemaking process. And I'll have a little video on, I think it's actually on making whiskey, which is yeast is used in that process as well. Now, how the yeast does that is the yeast breaks down glucose that's present, say in the flour that you use in baking, or if it's beer you're making, it's the barley that's used, or the barley that's used in the whiskey, or if it's wine making, it's the grapes, there's glucose that's in there. So the glucose that's there gets broken down by the yeast. It's using that glucose as energy. And in that process, carbon dioxide is made and ethanol. Now, ethanol is an alcohol, and we call this process fermentation. Now, when the yeast is doing this, it's looking at giving itself energy. It's not interested in giving us alcohol or carbon dioxide. It's doing it for its own purposes. But we use this process to make the substances that we find useful. And for example, in bread making, when dough is rising, so you mix your dough with the yeast and with water and with some sugar as well, as that helps too. The yeast will feed on the glucose and the sugar and in the flour, and it will produce carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide makes the bread dough actually rise. And then ethanol is also produced there as well, but you put the bread into the oven, so the alcohol gets burnt off, and you're left with all the wee holes that are inside the bread where the carbon dioxide has been, and that makes these little pockets and makes the bread all nice and risen and springy. Now, on the other hand, if the yeast is breaking down, say something like grapes, it's breaking down the glucose in grapes, then it's really the ethanol or the alcohol that you're interested in that's being produced. It's actually a byproduct from the process. The yeast isn't interested in producing alcohol for us, it just produces it as a byproduct. And eventually, if there's too much of it present, it will kill the yeast off. But we use this process of fermentation to produce these useful substances. The other thing that can be produced by microorganisms, and hopefully I will be able to get this slide to change over, here we are here, is the making of biofuels. Now, we can use bacteria to make things like biogas. And biogas is produced by the bacteria because they break down or they decompose animal and plant material, and that produces methane gas. And that methane gas can be used for heating things, it can be burnt, and in some places the bacteria can be used for breaking down sewage. And the breaking down of that sewage or food waste can also be used to produce biogas. And in some cases they do this in some places, and they use the methane that's produced to heat, so a factory or something. So say if it's a sewage works, they would use that methane to heat up the sewage works. We've got people coming in and out here while I'm recording this, so a few wee interruptions. So your notes should include information about bacteria, and talk about the yogurt making and the breaking down of the lactose and the sugar to lactic acid, and that will obviously change the pH. And then your yeast information should say about yeast being a fungus, and you should have a note as well about saying that glucose is broken down to carbon dioxide and alcohol. And I will leave some videos that you can watch, and that will be on your iTunes U course. I'm not sure if they will work from the link that is on here. You could always try, and that is this key area.